All right, well, welcome back, everyone. It's been a little bit of a break, and we have a heavy chapter for today. This is kind of a situation unto itself, so I'm not going to do too much recapping of where we've been and where we're going, because this is kind of an isolated story, and it's one of the stories that in biblical studies is classified as a text of terror. That comes from feminist theologians who look at certain parts of the Bible and say, like, this is terrible, this is indefensible, this is just one of the things that, especially for women, can be very hard to read. So I want to couch that at the beginning, that talking about Dinah and her whole situation here, we're going to approach it tenderly. There is the classic interpretation of it, but I also want to share with you all some modern rethinking of it and relooking at it. There is a lot of complexity here, as there always is. There is the politics, but I do just want to name up front that this is a heavy chapter. Hey, Joe. Hey, Gary.
This is one chapter where having this guide was, I mean, it's what, 20 pages explaining this chapter and why it might be in the Bible. And then, as you say, goes ancient interpretation, modern interpretation. It was fascinating to read about chapter 34 in this How to Read the Bible. It's really covered extensively.
Yeah. So what are some of your initial takes from the story? Let's talk about some reactions. You can talk about Kugel and what he says about it. What are some of the thoughts after reading through some of this?
It really is a book of terror. I mean, it's really unbelievable what they did, and but then at the bottom of the page it talks about that people are all representatives of cities or territories or something. So I'm thinking, oh well, okay, what does that mean? But in relation to this, very hard to read. It doesn't put adult circumcision in a very good light either. It's just used as punishment.
It's certainly I feel like it shows the reality of adult circumcision. It does not like shy away from that, certainly. So any other thoughts, reactions to Dinah's story right at the beginning?
The beginning of the story, or anywhere in the story,
or just overall? But before we dive in, I'm curious what you all are thinking, where you all are like thinking about with this story in general for the whole thing.
What struck me was at the end, after they had murdered all the men, that they absorbed the women and children into their community. And when they would have children with the women that came in, they would be tainting the bloodline. And so that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, there is, once again, there's interesting politics, and bloodlines have so far been important. So like, what's going on with the bloodlines here? What's happening? Why?
It's the whole idea of intermarriage, and how against it
why did you do that? The other thing is, nobody asked Dinah what she wanted to do.
Right.
It's all decided by the brothers.
Well, wouldn't that have been typical though?
Yeah, I know, just same thing again.
It's interesting with her in particular, though, where some of the women have voice. She doesn't even have voice in the story. She is someone who is acted on by everyone.
Mhm.
Literally.
Yeah. So before we actually dive into the text here, I'm actually going to do something that I don't do often. You know me, I like to just read through the story very slowly and pick things apart. Today, I actually want to go to the biblical law first to give us a little bit of context. And here is why I'm going to Leviticus and Deuteronomy at the beginning. So while chronologically, this story takes place way before Moses, before the tablets, before God was on Sinai giving the law, there are two reasons why it actually might behoove us to look in that direction. The first being that the Levitical law, it's very well documented that the laws that it contained, many of them were well established within the culture already. I've talked before about the goring ox and how this shows up in a lot of Babylonian law codes as a way to discuss culpability and liability. A lot of the sexual codes are also thought, a lot of this is seen other places. This isn't made whole cloth up originally. So it's kind of a looking at the Levitical code is one way to kind of look at like what was already in the cultural zeitgeist. The other thing to consider is that by the time these stories were assembled, as we've talked about, the whole story would be known. We have already seen the way that stories here kind of echo Moses and or like prefigure Moses in the Exodus. You can tell there's parts of Genesis that already kind of know where the story's going. So there's like almost a breadcrumb trail that's going to lead us to Moses. We've seen this in like Who Goes to Egypt or plagues or different characters that kind of echo the story of Moses in the Exodus. And that kind of shows us that a lot these 5 books were seen as a packaged unit, and by the time they were assembled, most people would know the packaged unit. So a story like this would be seen through the laws that come later. And so we can kind of, I just want to get an understanding of like what were people concerned about, because we today have a lot more language and nuance. We have a very different value system and whose voice gets prioritized and whose pain is prioritized. And I think that will give us a little bit of a window into kind of the situation itself. So the first one I'm going to jump us ahead to, if you want to put your finger in where Genesis is. The first important thing to consider is in Leviticus 18. What I'll say, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, those 3 were written together. It's very clear that these are like 3 stories that were written one after another. The stylisticness of the writing is cohesive, the tone is cohesive, the subject matter is cohesive. Deuteronomy is a very different case. I'm not going to go too much into Deuteronomy, but you can tell it was written later, but it's still considered one of the 5 books of Moses, so we'll get to that one second. So Leviticus 18 in particular is important because it goes through the list of proper and improper sexual relations. So this is who they literally delineate basically who you can and cannot have sex with in this chapter by their own standards. A lot of this seems second nature to us. A lot of this has a like ick factor, I would say, because a lot of this chapter is basically don't have sex with your family is the summary of this chapter. But the way that it talks about it shows kind of how they conceptualized the act of sex. So I'm going to skip forward to verse 6. The first part is just a prelude that happens again and again and again. I, the Lord God, am the God of Israel. Follow my words. And so the rules start at 6. And you will notice how this language actually echoes the story of Noah, which is why we kind of talked about this already with Noah, with his sons uncovering his nakedness. This is the idiom that's used here, is uncovering the nakedness. AKA don't have sex with. That's very clear. Uncovering nakedness and sex are the same thing in this passage. So it very quickly up front says, don't do it to your father, don't do it to your mother. And it's not really given an explanation. It's like, they're your father, they're your mother, don't do it. But then it starts delineating very specifically of who you cannot and why. So do not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. This is specifically not your mother, but it is your father's other wife. So even though she's not your mother, don't do it, because uncovering her nakedness is uncovering the nakedness of your father. And there we start to see the understanding that women are property. And there's no way to get around that. Is having sex with your father's other wife is having sex with your dad because she belongs to him, is the understanding there. So going really quickly through this list. So don't do it to your father's wife. Don't do it to your sister, because your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or abroad. So don't do it if she's your mother's daughter. Don't do it if it's not if it's only a half sibling. Don't do it. Don't do it if she's in your household. Don't do it if she was born a long ways away. Sisters are off limits. So your sons, do not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, your daughter's daughter, your father's wife's daughter, your father's sister, your mother's sister, your father's brother, your father's brother's wife, your daughter's in-laws. So in-laws are also out. Don't do it for your brother's wife. Do not for a woman and her daughter. So you cannot have sex with both mother and daughter. And you can't have sex with your son's daughter or her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter. And you shall not take a woman as a rival to her sister, which notably, Jacob has already broken that rule because he did take a wife as a rival to her sister. This says you have to wait till the first sister is dead, and then you can take her sister as a wife. So I'm going to pause there for some reactions. What do you think of this list? Is there anything missing?
Oh, missing.
You mean as in someone who is not related?
No, there is actually one relation not included in this list of don't do it. And that is your own daughter. Your own daughter is not included. She's actually in the fair game territory because she is your property.
Oh, okay.
So you start to see how this is all about, like, who is entitled to say yes and who is entitled to say no. So you can't have sex with your brother's wife because she belongs to your brother. You shouldn't have sex with your brother because that violates his rights as a man, because men are the ones with rights. You can't have sex with your mother because that violates your father's rights to her. You can't have sex with your sister because that violates your father's rights. And on down the line, and you can see where it all relates back to which men are you violating the rights of. And because your daughter is under your household and she is your right, she is not included.
It's all about property, not about feelings or, okay.
Right.
So incest is fair game.
Only if it's your own daughter.
On your own daughter. Well, that's one of. What about your stepdaughter?
Stepdaughter, that is one where I believe that one's included in this list.
Okay.
Yeah, down verse 17. Woman and her daughter, you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter.
Okay.
complicated.
Jeez.
So that is kind of our first step in, and this is important when looking at the story of Jacob doesn't, or we're going to see where he asserts himself and doesn't assert himself in the story, because in their worldview, Dinah's sexual relations are actually in the purview of Jacob's authority. Actually, before I get to that next comment, we're going to flip to the next big chunk where it talks about some of the nuance of sexual relations. So leaving Leviticus 18 behind, I want you all to flip over to Deuteronomy 22. I'm going to do a speed run of why Deuteronomy is a little bit different. Basically, the introduction of Deuteronomy, it says that like Moses is about to climb up on the mountain and the people are about to go into the promised land. And this is one long sermon of like Moses hitting the greatest hits, reminding all the people. There's a few rules and laws that are changed and updated. There's a few extra things you actually only find in Deuteronomy. We know by the words and the grammar and kind of how it's written that this was likely a much later addition. There's a lot of talk about the Deuteronomistic historian. This book actually matches some later books, but it's still included in the 5 books of Moses because it still is said to be written by Moses because it's basically his farewell sermon. So this is one of the things that exists only in Deuteronomy, and it's kind of an expansion on what we just read in Leviticus. So Deuteronomy 22, there's a bunch of miscellaneous laws. And then there's a chunk starting at 13 that deals with sexual relations that weren't covered in the last section. The first one the first big chunk here, I'm not going to dwell too much on because it's not as applicable, but I think it's still important to point out. This is a situation where a man marries a woman, and there is some contention here. This is complicated and hard to I don't think it's very clear cut, because this is not just about a woman being a virgin when being married. And there, in a lot of the text, virgin and young woman are used interchangeably. This is one where they're very much meaning that she has not had sex before. The weird thing about this is this concerns specifically a man who marries a woman and then wants out of the situation, who decides he doesn't like her and uses her virginity as a way out. So this is actually about false accusations. Often women had higher dowries if they were virgins. This is part of the negotiation. Fathers had incentive to keep their daughters from having sex without their permission because it was a monetary thing, because there would be no question of parental status or any of those things. The ideal was to marry a daughter who had not had sex with anyone else. The complaint here is false advertising. I married a woman and I had no proof of her virginity. But this is specifically because he dislikes her. The proof of it is literally that the parents would save basically the sheet that they had their first sexual encounter on. And this is a very old understanding of what virginity is like and what your first sexual experience is like, because it's basically, if you need to prove your daughter is innocent, you hold up a bloody sheet and show that she bleeds. We know by modern science now that is not actually accurate. That deals more with anxiety, and nervousness is often when women bleed with their first sexual experience. But that is still the norm in this time, is if she bleeds, she's considered a virgin. And so they hold up a sheet and say, look, we made good on our promise. We can prove our daughter was a virgin. We did not lie to you. So it's about lying, actually. However, if it is proof, if they don't have that proof for whatever reason, the punishment is her stoning, because once again she has done something that a woman taking sexual relations of her own accord violates her father's property rights. That is the issue. It's not that she isn't a virgin, it's that she took something away from her father. So that is the one of the dynamics here is what happens when a man is dissatisfied. Notably, there is no issue if the man is satisfied and loves the woman. It's a non-issue. This is about lying. The second set of situations is the one that are the passages that actually distinctly deal with rape, and is the only time in the Bible we actually get any discussion of this. So this is the first in 22, we get a man caught lying with the wife of another man. So not a family relationship, but just basically adultery. Notably, it says they both shall die. The punishment for adultery is the same for men and women, and if they're both caught, they are both to be stoned. The second one, or the next series, is about a woman who is engaged. So if she is engaged to be married to another man, and a man meets with her in the town, then you bring them both to the city gates once again and stone them. The other situation, if a woman who is engaged to be married and is raped in a field, only the man is responsible, because if the woman cries, you cannot hear her. Basically, the assumption, and this is where you get into some of the weird nuances. In the first situation where it's in the town, it is considered consensual if she does not scream. The assumption here is that if a woman is being forced into sex, she is going to make a lot of noise, and then people can go and save her. So, but if she's not making noise, that means it's consensual, which means it's adultery, which means she is violating some man's rights. Whereas in a field, if you can't hear her, she's considered innocent. And this is the situation of Dinah. And in only that situation, the man only is punished, but it's still punishable by death. Lastly, if a man meets a virgin, so someone who is not engaged to be married, seizes with her and has sex with her, and they are caught, then she is forced to marry him. There's a set bride price, and they are forced to basically be married. And he is never allowed to divorce her. A divorce is not an option. And why this seems very barbaric by our standards, this is actually, in a sense, to protect her, because she can no longer get the bride price that she would have otherwise been available. It is seen as security and protection. She is now in that household. He is now forced to provide for her. He will never not be allowed to provide for her. And she is now given an umbrella of security and a family and safety. And so while we think it's like being forced to marry your rapist sounds horrible, it is the way they understood protection. At least she has someone feeding her and sheltering her, and no one can harm her besides her husband. So those are the sexual laws, and they do, I'm curious of some of your all's reaction to this set of laws and kind of some of the worldview that it's working with here.
It's interesting because in the story in Genesis, the man wants to marry her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they aren't having it. So we don't know what Dinah wanted, but so I don't really understand why they were so harshly, but they punished him so harshly unless they really were worried about being absorbed and losing their identity. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of what the other people had in mind. We think, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the fact that they're Canaanites. that's a big no-no.
Mhm. All right. So with that kind of backdrop and kind of seeing some of the rules that did govern, like I said, we don't know how much of those later laws influence this situation, but a lot of these would already be in the zeitgeist. There is the list of people you don't do things to, and there's also the things you do when the norms are violated. And so the story, let's actually dive into what's happening here, and we can give some more texture to this situation in particular. So the first verse here, Dinah, the daughter of Leah. We get immediately her in the context of her mother. This comes into play at the end of the story because the two brothers who do most of the action are her direct brothers. The rest of the clan are all half siblings. Shechem and Levi are her two old mother's brother kind of a thing. So they have a little bit more incentive to protect their sister. Their honor is a little bit more tied to them in particular. So this situation comes about because Dinah went out to visit the women of the region. So Dinah is the only sister. So it sounds like she's going out to meet the women. And so she is going to meet people. And in the process, she is either unguarded, unsupervised. Her brothers are not doing their duty to protect her. And therefore, she is accosted in a field by one of the Canaanite men. And that all happens in very succinctly in a few verses, but then the next verse is, his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. So this is where the traditional interpretation of this text and some modern theologians actually conflict a little bit. And why I brought up some of the scripture or the laws that kind of govern the worldview. They don't really have language for what a young lovers who are meeting each other covertly in a field would be. Some modern historians actually think that this was not a forced relationship, but actually that these are two teenagers in love who are using excuses to meet up in a field and they were caught. Just because there is a tenderness on the man's side. But the thing is, if Dinah couched it in language of being forced, it actually protects her and her honor in a certain way, because that actually means that they both, if they were caught as young lovers, they actually may be stoned because it's a violation of rights. Whereas if she says it's forced and she is not engaged, they actually get married. If you see the distinction, so she may be trying to actually marry him after being caught in like a young lover situation. That's a very recent interpretation, but I feel like it's interesting to consider right up at the front of like the question of where is Dinah's agency and like what's actually happening in this situation. So what do you all think of that kind of interpretation of these actually might just be two young people being young people who got caught? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, to me, it kind of explains why she was in his house when they went to get her, that she was, if it was two young lovers, then she was there voluntarily. You know, it puts that scenario in place for me, but you know, how it all plays out in the end, she really started, I don't know what I want to say. I mean, a massacre, and how it turned out by, you know, whatever her words were at this time. So that's it.
And wasn't there a law or something that you had to be circumcised?
Mhm.
I mean, that's, so now that comes into it.
So the circumcision is that comes in like an interesting way, where by circumcising that's actually this clan trying to actually assimilate those people. And that's the question of if there's an attempt here to mutually assimilate each other, versus keeping the clans separate. Circumcision would be wanted for Dinah's husband, but then the request is for it to be the entire clan, which would then open up more trade relations and a closer knit relationship, which would bring the tribes closer together. So or that gets a little bit complicated, and I don't think we have the time to go into it right now. There is a long, like, for a lot of the Old Testament, back and forth and back and forth, there's this discussion of like, can you marry outsiders? No, don't marry outsiders. Can you give your daughters to other tribes? No, don't do that. Oh, but they're good. Oh, but they're bad. And there's a constant dialogue. And actually, scripture does not come down on one side of whether it's okay to marry outsiders. On the one hand, we have stories like this. On the other hand, we have stories like Ruth. Ruth, who is a Moabite, who is the enemy, and we see her be the most righteous of Israelites who marries into the situation. So we see this constant discussion. It's not going to end here, but this is one part of the discussion that says, don't marry outsiders. And part of that, yeah, is circumcision. Are you part of the covenant? And her brothers seem to want to say, if my sister's going to marry someone, she needs to be part of the covenant. All right, so continuing on, because Shechem seems to really like Dinah, whether it is he took her forcefully, whether they are young lovers and they just need to deal with the situation now, he asks his dad, hey, go get me this girl. I want her. Go get her. Go make the relationship. And so his dad goes. Jacob hears about the interaction. And at the time where Jacob initially hears it, the brothers are in the field. But by the time dad comes to negotiate the bride price, the brothers come in. Notably, remember that Jacob is the one who owns the rights to Dinah in this worldview. He is the one who has been, his honor is the one who's actually at stake. It is his property rights. He is the one who should act. However, what we see instead is that when the sons of Jacob hear this, they speak. They were indignant. They were angry because they had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, as ought not to be done. So we get that little moralistic, this should not have been done. But it ends up being the sons who negotiate the deal. Jacob is actually notably very silent until the very end here, even though it is actually technically him who is supposed to make this deal. But what we hear is Hamor's plea with the brothers, make marriage with us. And it's not just like give us Dinah. We want this one girl for my son, but it's we should make a deal for all of your daughters and all of our daughters, for all of your sons and all of our sons. What Hamor is probably seen is he walks into a household of 12 guys, or at this point it's 11 dudes and one daughter. Like, there's a lot of sons who probably want wives, and at this point they don't have any women to marry. So like making a relationship between the two tribes seems like a good idea. Hey, we have daughters, you have sons, like 7 brides for 7 sons kind of a deal. Like, can we make a relationship where everyone wins? Let's make these relationships. We'll be good trade partners. We'll both get property, like we're gonna like mutually benefit, like if we have these relationships. And he says he's gonna pay any price. He's willing to put anything out there. So what do you think of this initial offer of, I want a relationship with you. It's not just about this one girl. Sorry about that. But we want an ongoing relationship, so we're on good terms. Always comes back to trade relations, doesn't it?
Yeah, but one of the things I noticed was when you get to verse 23, and Hamar says, but won't everything that they have be ours?
Yeah.
So it's not just, hey, we can get, married and have great relations and everything, but he's looking at their stuff will become our stuff. That jumped out at me.
Yeah.
And I think that goes kind of into that, or the comment that Kugel is making about the blending and the combining, the like mutual mixing. Because remember, Jacob has 11 sons at this point. Sons inherit property, the daughters don't. So actually, Jacob stands to like keep a lot of his stuff in his line. It's just the daughters that would move over. But I think the thought is, if these two tribes merge, then their stuff is our stuff is their stuff. They're going to take care of us, kind of a thing. Or we're going to slowly take from them, and then we're going to absorb them.
But I'm getting the part where I don't know the verses around 23, 24, where Shechem and his father, whatever, believed that all of Jacob's property, whatever, will become theirs. I'm not seeing the part where theirs become Jacob's property. I'm not seeing the community. To me, it looks like Hammer and his son think that they will prosper and be in charge of this whole new community. So what am I missing here?
I think there's nothing specifically said that so let me start over. You're right. They very much think if they send their daughters to marry into this little clan of people, that they are going to profit. They think they're going to get their stuff. It's just kind of extrapolating out, like, how would that work? Because they wouldn't get their stuff just by marrying their daughters into it, because daughters don't inherit. It might be because of bride prices, that it's like, oh, if we marry our daughters out, we can just have very high bride prices, and then they have to give us a bunch of stuff. But there's mention, or in the first time that they talk, our land shall be open with you, live and trade in it, and get property in it. It's kind of, there's the initial comment of like, stay here, get property, trade with us, and they just think they'll come out on the better side of the trade issues, I think. So they are kind of selfish here, saying like, we're going to profit if we marry into it. We're going to get their stuff over time.
Okay.
So, but it sounds like the get the stuff over time hinges on the Jacob's like clan of people kind of settling down and becoming them, because they're saying like, buy property here, and then they're kind of under their governance too, because they're staying there.
And we don't really know what God is thinking about this.
No.
I mean, he hasn't spoken. It said some, I guess maybe in the footnotes, that at this time it appears that the Israelites were kind of worshiping the Canaanite gods because they had the same name for God, El.
El is a generic name.
It's very generic, but that's what it says in my footnotes.
Yeah, this is where it starts to get blurry. Like, the more that the Israelites kind of get mixed in with the Canaanites, the clarity of the kind of what God are we talking about gets very fuzzy. So these are people that are likely culturally are similar-ish. I would say, I mean, it's kind of like the division between Michigan and Ohio. Like, Michigan and Ohio do have their differences, but they're also like more similar than Michigan and New York.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So So the thing is, though, even though Jacob seems to acquiesce, he's not throwing a fit over this. The tribe that is doing this, the Canaanites, are like, yeah, this is gonna be great. And secretly, the brothers are hatching a plan. And their plan amounts to be, we're gonna ask all the men to be circumcised. All the men. It's like, if we're going to kind of like fuse a little bit, all of the men need to be circumcised. You all have to do this. It would be disgraceful for us to be in this. And this is evidently a good enough prospect that the men agree. They literally go to the town square and they say, hey, we want to work with these people. We all need to get circumcised. And they do it. And then what happens is 2 days afterwards, and it literally says, when the men are still in pain, the brothers attack and slaughter everyone. They literally use the circumcision to basically encumber the men so they're not good fighters because they're in too much pain. And then they basically take over the city, killing all the men, but not the women and children. And then they take the women and the children. It's not said if they take them as wives or servants. Either one would be fair game in ancient law.
Well, I forget this guy's name. Hammer must have seen tremendous advantage to the merger of the two clans to have all the men agree to do this. This is a very high price for them to pay when it all comes down to Dinah and their young prince. There must have been something that they foresaw as a real advantage to get them to do this. So, that's just motivation kind of a thing. Why were the men all agreeing to do this? Because, that's pretty severe.
Well, the one verse says, if you will not listen to this deal and be circumcised, we're going to take our daughter and go home. So that young man who is referred to as the prince of the land, he must have a lot of hold over the rest of them to be able to say, I want this girl so badly that I want you guys to do all of this.
Here's the other thing that I bring up, because I feel like we haven't considered this aspect in a while, even though we talked about it a lot in early Genesis. This is not just 4 wives and 12 sons and 1 daughter. This is the family. Remember the family business that we were talking about with Abraham, that they kind of have a moving city with them, with servants and people attending flocks. And we've read about how many, like the size of the flocks that Jacob has amassed. And this is now, he's kind of an old man. We see his children are grown up. If he's as successful as he's been with Laban, this is a lot of wealth here. And he has a small moving city with him. So marrying the daughters isn't just like specifically Jacob's daughters. It's also the daughters of their company. It's their servants. It's their people. It's the marrying of like the underclass that goes with them. So this is yes, there is the prince of the area, the guy who holds a lot of sway. He wants this one girl. But also the people are looking at like this moving city and going, oh wait, if they settle here, we have a lot of options here. This is really good. And evidently it's a sweet enough deal that like, yeah, it's enough to incentivize an entire city to get circumcised in a day. But yeah, it's probably a pretty sweet deal. They see it as a good deal.
Wow.
The thing is, in the end, the brothers are more concerned with their honor. And we see this again and again in cultures that have a high regard for family honor, is that there's a lot of violence specifically targeted to women and around the goings on of women, that they would rather take the city by force than allow these trade relations. And so the brothers do it because they feel dishonored. And
Well, I also see where the next generation from Jacob, and we've talked about him being a trickster and, you know, the kind of things he did, he's kind of fading into the background and his sons are emerging, and this is a major trickster. You know, they are picking up, you know, the behavior, and you know, I guess I'm just rambling now, but I see the next generation playing that role.
right, you see the habits of the father transfer onto the habits of the sons, that they learned well in some ways. What's interesting though is reading down a little bit further, yeah, the sons are being the tricksters, but Jacob's all of a sudden very unhappy about this. When he gets word of it, he says, "You have brought trouble on me by making me odious to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." And so Jacob looks at what his sons did and he's like, "You just ruined all of our trade relations. No one's going to want to deal with this. Like, what in the world have you done? Like, that was stupid," is kind of what he's saying. You did not think this through, and how it's not just about honor, but like our trade relations are just sunk now. And he's unhappy with his sons, even though they kind of live out that trickster role that he once was himself.
Well, and he's worried about the Canaanites and Perizzites combining forces and attacking him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they I will say they don't end up doing it, but it does look like this one clan attacked. Like they are not organized into a nation, but you could see them now as a threat. And so there might be, I think the thought here is, we don't want the other neighboring cities taking us out as a precaution, since you all just slaughtered a city. Like, come on. But notably, at this point, we hear nothing of Dinah. Dinah's evidently been in the house of this prince, and she is taken by her brothers. It says they rescued her from their house. Their honor, they say, is preserved. But that's the last mention of Dinah. We don't get what she wanted. We don't get what her thoughts were on the situation. We don't even hear about her later in the story and what happened to her. Did she get married? Did she become a spinster? We don't know.
She could even be pregnant.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, but she's not the major player in all this.
No, she's not.
You know,
Leah's
She's-
sons are.
you know, she's the impetus, but the whole story moves on beyond her, and she's insignificant at the end. You know, the boys want their honor, and you know, the focus is on them, not on her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what do we think of this story overall? What do we think about it being in the Bible? We often think of the Bible as a book of holiness, of guidance, a book where we hear God talk to us, and there's a story that is messy and complicated and possibly really terrible, but no matter how you cut the cake, it doesn't really treat the women in the situation what we would see as well. So why is it here? Why do we talk about it? God isn't even mentioned in this story.
Mm.
I would think that they would think God approves of this. This is how they feel, and they do everything right, and so this is okay. God approves of it. This is one of his laws or something, perhaps.
Well, there's a lot of violence in the Old Testament. Their solution to a lot of things is to kill everybody. So it seems to have been part of the culture. And I don't hear God saying you shouldn't do that.
Mhm.
You may say that you should not kill people, but that doesn't count if they're people outsiders.
I wish we knew the repercussions of this story. You know, that it went on to the next parcel of information of what actually was the outcome of this action, and how did it affect the neighboring clans, you know, just to see, you know, the rolling reaction, because in my mind, the brothers' reaction to Dinah being violated was way above and beyond, way out of proportion, and, you know, more self-serving, as they would see themselves very important in this new combination of communities. So, you know, I'm just taken away by how extreme their reaction was when what happened actually was not uncommon in this culture.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of my favorite Jewish sayings is read everything on the page, including the white spaces. And the interpretation of this phrase is something along the lines of there is everything you need in the guidance of living, but sometimes it's actually in the spaces between the words. And what I see here is that, or by the end, there's not actually a consensus of what the right thing was to do. The brothers assert that they did what was right for their honor, and Jacob says, you messed up. This was not right. But we're not actually given like a final judgment of like who's correct in this situation. What we do have is a mirror to reflect on our own world and our own situation, and a mirror to reflect on what we think is good and bad and what could be changed, and what flaws in our own world do we have, and what flaws do we see that we don't want to endorse anymore. I think it's not every story is in the Bible is meant for us to emulate it. I feel like this story in particular is and why I don't shy away from it. There are some people who I've had friends who tore this page out of the Bible and said, I will never read that. And I want to keep it in because it gives us a chance to kind of think about what we do think as good and how should we react in certain situations. And we're, especially when we're thinking about the news these days and we're hearing about the struggle of women across the world, and rights in our own country, and thinking about what is right. How do we consider other people? We see here that women are property and it causes a lot of issues. And I think that there's problems there. We see problems when honor is considered high above all else, and we see retribution as justice. And while there may not be a clear good answer here, a lot of things going on right now, there's not necessarily clear answers right now either, but we can have the discussion of whose story and opinion and voice are we giving light to, and who is missing in the situation. It's notable in this story that Dinah is missing, except for people acting to and around her. And so it can kind of be that mirror to think about ourselves and what we hold as values.
Yes.
That not all other cultures believe We have ours, but there are still places in the world where there are honor killings. And you read this and you think, maybe this is their Bible and what they're reading and taking it verbatim, because there are honor killings. And when it comes to courts of our liking, they don't really understand the nuances of the other cultures.
Yeah. I mean, go for it.
I was so struck by reading when you start to read the details of about what actually happens during war, and it's not just recently, is that rape seems to be a tool of dominance or violence or retribution. What the Russians are doing in
Ukraine.
thank you. Thank you. And what everybody did in the Second World War, but the Russians are big rapists. They did that at the end of the Second World War too. It's cruelty. I think it's cruelty. It has nothing to do with property rights or anything like that. I don't think it's just to hurt and terrorize,
Dominate.
Yeah.
yes, dominating, yeah. And everybody, says, oh, that's another war crime. Well, what are you going to do about it? It's just horrible. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I just, it's, what was I gonna say? Oh, part of this is, so the hard thing that I always have to take a moment and pause with is, as much as I sometimes want to point the finger at like news stories where I see honor killings, and then looking actually at Christian communities, and there's actually there are groups who do see these scriptures as not just descriptive of like describing what happens, but prescriptive, and honor killings do still happen in Christian communities too. And that's I think that's purely because humans are humans no matter what religion you're a part of, and there's just human things that humans do, and this seems to be one of the things that is oddly fairly consistent across the world. Is like there are parts of cultures that take things to a place where it ends up with violence towards women. And that is, there's probably a better anthropological reason as to why, but it seems like most cultures struggle with this to a certain degree. So this one doesn't have clear-cut answers, or a clear-cut takeaway almost. And I think it should continue to trouble us and continue to make us think. But it is at the end of the hour today. So I hope you have something joyful today to balance out this heavy topic we've been discussing. We'll, in the notes, last time we talked about having a schedule of our readings like I did last time. I put another one together. I have to finish up the notes for today, but we'll have a reading schedule out for the rest of Genesis, which takes up, if we do like a chapter a week, it takes us basically right up around Easter. What I will say, fair warning from here, some of the chapters will be longer. While I was going back and forth whether to split them up because they are longer, but as you can see, the narratives have kind of elongated a little bit versus the beginning where it was like very like myth, and we could take them in littler chunks. We're about to enter Joseph and Joseph's story, where it's much more narratively based and much closer to our modern understanding of storytelling. We've seen kind of the change in how things are written. So when it comes to Joseph, I'm just giving you a heads up, the chapters will be longer, but I think we can handle it, if that sounds good.
You sent out a list of chapters in the assignments before you went on vacation.
Oh, I did? Okay. It just didn't make it into the notes then.
out to June, at the end of May.
Oh, really? Oh. I don't
I may
know.
be wrong, but I think I just took a look at it because I was.
May 2nd is Genesis 50.
Oh, May 2nd, yeah.
May
okay.
2nd, okay. So
Well,
it'll
Easter-
take us to the summer.
Okay, so, yeah. Are we going to continue with, is your thought that we will then do the next chapter in the Bible, or?
We can discuss. Genesis has been a lot of background and a lot of
Right.
kind of context for some of the Gospels. Exodus is the other very context-giving one. The second half of Exodus begins the laws and the rules. So we can discuss if we want to jump back and forth and do something in the New Testament, we can also do that. So we'll discuss when it gets to summer. If we've had about enough as we can take of the Old Testament, we can jump forward and then jump back. Or we can do something like Psalms or Proverbs, which is a different tone, a different kind of genre. So we have many options. So we don't have to do Exodus, only if you all want.
Okay.
All right. Well, can I pray us out for today?
Yes.
All right. God, there are stories that are troubling, and sometimes, God, it is good that our hearts are disturbed. So I ask that you be with us, though, that you trouble our hearts when they need to be troubled, and we find peace in you when we desperately need peace. There is a lot that troubles us in the news today, and we always are seeking after you and your guidance. Sometimes it feels like we know exactly what you would say, and sometimes we're searching for you in the white areas on the page, hoping to hear your voice in between all the things that are happening. So we give you thanks for the beginning of a new year, another chance to seek after you again and again. I give you thanks for this group here that returns week after week and year after year now to study your word, to wrestle with it together so we might find you somewhere in between. I give you thanks, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Have a good week.